Hey guys, today I will be reviewing SpongeBob Season 10.
Hey, you're just a Pie Guy Rules ripoff. Shut up, you unoriginal loser.
Let me explain. A lot of the time, Season 10 gets overlooked. It's just that short, boring season that's not as good as Seasons 9 and 11. But is it really not as good as the others? Now, while I can definitely see why someone would rather have this than this, or even worse, this, I still think Season 10 is a pretty good season, even if the DVD set is trash. So put on your bunny slippers, your useless branding merchandise hat, and get your frisbees ready, because it's time to jump right into SpongeBob Season 10. Episode 205A, Whirly Brains. SpongeBob and Patrick fly their brains like drones. Well, this episode's interesting. It has a toy where you put a propeller on your brain and then you fly it around like a drone. SpongeBob and Patrick just really want it, and then the whole town gets hooked on it, and then some guy steals their brains. The plot is just all over the place, and I don't even know where to start with this one. Well, I liked the commercial, and I like how they literally got reeled into buying the product. And the "let's call Sandy" joke was kind of funny. Of course, there's a scene with Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff dating, and I liked Squidward's giant nose. Yeah, there isn't really anything else that I liked. So, there's a scene where after SpongeBob and Patrick lose their brains, Patrick puts a diaper inside of his head, and he says it feels squishy. They spy on Squidward while he's naked, and for some reason there's only one guy in town who's smart enough to not let his kid have a whirly brain. And I really wasn't amused by SpongeBob and Patrick just messing around with their brains and doing random stuff to people, because it just wasn't entertaining at all. And then Sandy feels forced. That weird security guard guy, played by Ed Asner, feels super forced too, and I don't like that character at all. He's just stupid. You know, this episode is really stupid. Also, I should probably note, this is one thing that happens a lot during the season, but it's really strong in this episode. The facial expressions. Characters seem to have a lot of wacky facial expressions and stuff like that, and it's just kinda off. Now, I initially did not know what I thought of this episode, but after watching it 3 times, it is a bad episode. Yes, we're starting off with a bad episode, and I also just realized how incredibly simplistic that rating was. Really, the only redeemable qualities were the ones I mentioned earlier. There isn't anything else that I liked about this episode. Also, Pingle Bingle Money compilation playlist is down below. You're welcome. Episode 205B, Mermaid Pants. SpongeBob and Patrick play Mermaid Man. So this episode is really interesting because it seems like no matter how many times I watch it, I cannot get tired of it. So first of all, I really liked the part where SpongeBob and Patrick are playing just like around the neighborhood at the beginning, and they tried to incorporate Squidward just like they did in Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 1. I really like the part where they sing to the Line Man, which is the main background theme for the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes and title cards. I think Mr. Krabs liking comic books was actually a really clever twist, and it actually fits his character really well, and I think it actually strengthens the episode and makes it much more entertaining, because I think the episode got much more entertaining and extreme when Mr. Krabs joined in, and that makes it a lot more fun. I like this one part at the start where when Squidward gets mad at SpongeBob and Patrick, it plays an angry sound, but it turns out it's coming from the Krusty Krab, which is like a school late bell kind of thing. I really like those kind of satire action cards that they play that say like subpar and pathetic and sad and all that stuff when they're fighting in the Krusty Krab at first. I like the part where they go out and get a bunch of equipment and stuff to make the Krusty Krab all decked out into like a lair. And I really like how Squidward turns on everyone and goes full on evil at the end. It's something that really fits his character and I think works with the story really well. It is definitely a good episode, and I cannot get tired of this no matter how hard I try. And trust me, I have tried before. Also, I really like the line at the end where the narrator says he needs to get another job. Episode 206A, Unreal Estate. Squidward tricks SpongeBob into moving. Okay, I'm sorry, I just gotta get this out of the way right now. I love the part where Squidward's like a freaking fountain, and then like all the kids go over and like dance in the water, and then SpongeBob turns off the hose, and then they get like all sad, and I don't know, I just think that part is so funny for some reason. Anyway, the way Squidward tricks SpongeBob into thinking he's allergic to his pineapple is pretty entertaining and kind of a creative take on this one. I like how he sprinkles the pepper everywhere, and then Gary gets mad at him, and SpongeBob just wakes up and doesn't understand anything that's going on. I like the montage of SpongeBob doing things with his pineapple where they like go down the slide and then they go to the photo booth. Then of course there's the theme song parody, which is, I'm gonna be honest, that seems a little bit overrated, but it's not bad and it's still pretty funny. And I like the houses that they look at. My three favorite would have to be the coffin, drawers, and the fish tank. Those were probably my favorites. And then, of course, there's a twist ending where the house that Squidward ends up moving into turns out to be a rocket ship, which is kind of funny, but it's predictable at the same time. However, when the ship itself blasts off and there's like stock footage of a rocket flying out of the ocean, that part made me laugh pretty hard. All in all, I'll say it's a pretty good episode. Episode 206B, Code Yellow, SpongeBob gives Squidward a nose job. So, first of all, I should probably comment on this, but there's a lot of gross out in this episode. I don't really think it's that bad, but I mean, I can see why someone would be turned off by it. There's a pretty disgusting shot of Squidward's nose at the start of the episode, and there's like bugs on it and like pimples exploding, but I didn't think it was too much. And there isn't that much gross out in it anyway, so I can't really give the episode any shame for it. Anyway, I've just gotta say, I was actually pleasantly surprised with this episode. There were definitely a lot more funny jokes than I remembered. I really liked the part where SpongeBob fluffed Squidward's IV bag, as well as a lot of the puns he made. And as someone who makes really bad puns regularly, I've gotta say, SpongeBob sure has that pun-making talent. Also, there were some other minor things that I really liked, such as the sponge gag and the literal candy stripes on SpongeBob's uniform. I also really liked SpongeBob himself in this episode. He felt a lot more like he did in the older episodes than a lot of episodes in this season. And the fact that he was able to cure all these people just by doing random things was actually really entertaining to watch. This episode embraced his more childlike side, and I really liked that. Especially the part where he tried to drive on Mrs. Puff's iron lung like a submarine. Also, I like how he was able to help the guy with the broken legs just by putting a fake skeleton inside of him. And he even comes back later in the episode when SpongeBob's driving on the iron lung and we get an awesome My Legs joke. I also really like the creativity they did with him doing the nose job itself, such as making Squidward's nose a party streamer and having Squilliam be one of them. I also thought it was pretty funny how when SpongeBob cuts up Squidward, the doctor's on the other hospital bed putting him back together. And also at the end, Squidward decides he just wants the classic nose back, which SpongeBob is able to do in a pretty funny way. Also, I love how he tells the two nurses a pickup line at the end. That part was pretty funny. Overall, while definitely on the lower side, I will say this is a pretty good episode. There's a lot more funny stuff than I remembered, and while I may not come back to this one regularly, it is still a fun, entertaining watch all the way through. Episode 207A, Mimic Madness. SpongeBob imitates everyone until he forgets who he is. Okay, right away, I've just gotta point this out. This episode really gives me Missing Identity vibes, and that's probably not a good thing. Everyone loves this episode, and while I can definitely see where they're coming from, I've gotta say, this really does feel a lot like a ripoff of Missing Identity in a way. I mean, sure, it does some stuff different, but yeah, it kind of has a pretty similar plot. I could put the beginning scene in the diner of Missing Identity before this episode, and it would fit perfectly. However, that doesn't mean I don't like this episode. Sure, while I do think it is quite a bit overrated, it is still really entertaining to watch. Tom Kenny's voice work in this episode is outstanding. He does almost a spot-on impression of everybody except for Plankton and Sandy. And there were a lot of things I found funny in this episode too. And I love how everyone gets together to help SpongeBob out. And of course there's that song, which is pretty good, but once again, I do think it's a little overrated. It is a really great song, but, I mean, I think there are some better songs in the older seasons, and even some in the newer seasons, actually. Also, the start was pretty good. I really liked how they brought back the Bring It Around Town thing, and I like how Squidward was wearing a mask to prevent Mr. Krabs from finding out he was sleeping. Also, Squidward was pretty funny in this episode. I really liked the part where he mocked Mr. Krabs at the start. That got a pretty hard laugh out of me. And of course, there's that one fish with the kids when he gets mad at them to eat their patties. That part is funny no matter how many times I watch it. But once again with Tom Kenny, he really hits it out of the park with these impressions. Now of course there's characters like the narrator who he played already, so technically it wasn't an impression. Which, by the way, that narrator gag with the time card was pretty funny. But all the characters he doesn't play, he really can impersonate them pretty well. Also, I love the name of the illness thing SpongeBob gets. the mocking mimicry madness. And I really liked the part where everyone tried to impersonate SpongeBob because none of the other voice actors got it right. Also, I really liked the line where SpongeBob says he likes cooking with lard. So this episode brought back the I went to college line that Plankton says. Also, for some reason, the extra napkins part was pretty funny just because I love the way SpongeBob's head changes. I actually really like the way SpongeBob's head changes when he does his impersonations. It makes everything look really nice, in a way. Also, most of the time I found it pretty funny. The 5 at once part was really good, too. I actually really liked that part. You see, there's a lot of things I did like about this episode, but once again, it's another episode where SpongeBob forgets his identity. Or, I guess, kind of forgets who he is. Once again, this episode is quite similar from Missing Identity, but then again, they do share quite a bit of plot points. Even if this episode does follow a different story. Now, of course, I did like a lot of things, and I do think this is a good episode. However, it is still way overrated. This is not the best episode of SpongeBob. This is not even the best episode of the season. It's not even the best episode of the season so far. I thought both Mermaid Pants and Unreal Estate were better than this episode. However, this episode still is really good, and it is better than quite a few other episodes in Season 10. I just think it's weird that no one has ever pointed out the resemblance between this and Missing Identity before. In fact, I never even noticed it until I was making this review. But then again, with a show that's gone on as long as SpongeBob, it's kind of hard to not repeat yourself at some point. And it definitely does not take away from the fact that this is still a good episode. Episode 207B, Housewarming. Worms move inside of SpongeBob's pores. This episode is terrible. I'm sorry, but, like, this is the most unoriginal episode of the entire series. Or at least the most unoriginal episode of the entire post-sequel era. Well, stuff I liked. I liked the part with Plankton, and I liked the 3,000 Wapoos later. And I thought the wormy hands joke was pretty funny. But this is literally just jellyfish jam with worms. And a little bit of Spongehenge thrown into the mix. They even got the music! The music! They only stay because of the music! So, some worm comes and moves inside of SpongeBob. You know, like a tapeworm. And then, for some reason, SpongeBob's pressured into keeping him, and then he gets fired from the Krusty Krab for doing it. All the while, these worms are just partying and acting carefree when SpongeBob's suffering because of it. Then, once again, there's the part with Plankton where he comes and tries to exterminate them in order to get the formula, and it was pretty funny. But then SpongeBob goes to Patrick for help, and then Patrick flips out because SpongeBob makes some really psycho Who-Bob Wetpants-esque worm face. And then afterwards, he goes and tries to talk to Squidward about it, which, by the way, there was an audio error right there. Yeah, there was an audio error in this episode, of course, because, you know, this episode sucks. And then Squidward sprays him with the hose, and then, like, it's so bad. And then the worms just don't care, they just love partying. Which, by the way, let's talk about Prickles real quick. Prickles is one of the worst characters I've ever seen in this show. He's so frustrating. I hate this guy. I don't feel bad for him when SpongeBob kicks him and all his friends out, because it's justified. The episode tries to make you feel bad for him and all his worm friends, but it's like, no, I don't. So now they can just throw their parties inside of SpongeBob, get him fired, get him into more situations. It's terrible. This episode is so lazy, and it's shown through all the rehashes, the audio errors, and also because of the fact that they couldn't even get to 11 minutes and had to tack on episode 207C, Clam Up. Which, I don't even want to recap this episode, so I'm not going to. All you need to know about it is that it's a prequel and it ends where housewarming starts. Now, this episode shouldn't exist, but I'm gonna be a little bit nice on it and give it a mediocre episode, or short, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of interesting to see Prickles fight a clam, and I like how it ends where the episode starts, but it's like, it's so lazy! It doesn't need to exist at all! It's just proof that housewarming is lazy. So anyway, back to housewarming itself, if it wasn't already clear enough, this is a bad episode. Wow, what a surprise. This episode was a lot worse than I remembered it, and I am definitely not going to come back to this one anytime soon. Episode 208A, Snooze You Lose. Squidward won't wake up for his audition. One thing I want to point out is that the bus in this episode was red instead of orange like it normally is. I don't know, I just thought that was a little weird and something I should note for some reason. Anyway, this episode was a little bit creepy in some parts. It wasn't too bad. Like, I could watch this episode again, but there definitely were some creepy aspects about it. Like how SpongeBob and Patrick literally climb inside of Squidward and control everything he does. I liked some parts about this episode. Like how when Squidward takes a walk around town, he sees a bunch of stuff that would make you kind of feel tired and want to go to sleep. Like he sees a pillow store and he sees sheep jumping. Also, I laughed pretty hard at the part where the random pedestrian explodes after being hit by SpongeBob and Patrick. And the no dance zone was pretty funny. But I think the funniest part of this episode is when Patrick wakes up at SpongeBob's house and doesn't know where he is. And then he starts panicking over a rug and starts flipping out. That part made me laugh pretty hard. And then afterwards, when he realizes the rug is his, he starts rolling around in it and yelling random stuff. I don't know why, but I thought that was funny. I liked some of the creativity in the part where SpongeBob and Patrick are trying to wake up Squidward, and how they just make a new Squidward in a lab, but it turns out to be a failure. If I was rating this episode solely based off of humor, I'd say it probably is a good episode, because it's pretty funny. However, I'm not, and that's where this episode fails. Once again, this episode was pretty creepy, and SpongeBob and Patrick just playing amazingly inside of Squidward was incredibly predictable. And J.K. Simmons is incredibly pointless and doesn't really add anything to this episode. Like, I mean, the character kinda does, but, like, J.K. Simmons didn't need to be here, he just kind of is. And then SpongeBob completely destroys Squidward's brain, and then of course Squidward wakes up and causes a problem. However, when Squidward plays horribly and causes a bunch of buildings to collapse and stuff, I thought that was pretty funny. Or at least funny enough for me to chuckle at it. Once again, this is a pretty funny episode, but the story is pretty creepy and everything else is just a little off-putting. But it's not bad. It's just not something that I'd actively rewatch. It's a mediocre episode, but it's probably on the higher side. Episode 208B, Krusty Catering. Mr. Krabs caters a fancy party. This episode is amazing, and I loved every single second of it. Before I recap the episode and explain why I liked it, I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. This is a good episode. First of all, there's the kids' party, where Squidward's afraid of germs. Then there's Patrick as a clown. The Piñata Kid, where the kid intentionally hits Mr. Krabs so he can get his money. And SpongeBob as a bounce house was really funny. But after Squidward gets infested with germs, Patrick gets his head torn off, and SpongeBob gets popped by some kid with spiky cleats. They decide to leave the party. Then they get mistaken for a different catering company for a fancy party. And we get some really good scenes at the party, too. The best part about this episode, though, is that they managed to have 4 plots, and each one of them feels like it has just enough time, and they're all great. I love how Mr. Krabs uses Squidward's ink to make tuxedos, and for some reason I really like the way he rolls around at the check. I really liked the part with the kid who wants his birthday cake, especially the huge window gag. And later in the episode, Mr. Krabs even acts as a father figure for him. There's the scene with Squidward trying to join the band, and they keep running away from him. And Mr. Krabs even actually goes out and tries to return the gems that SpongeBob stole to make the Krabby Patties fancy. That part actually surprised me. I'd expect Mr. Krabs to just take the gems and be super cheap, but no, he actually tries to return them. I love the parts with Psycho Patrick, and I love the food fight scene especially. Then there's the best part of the episode. Mr. Krabs, who's still trying to return the gems, keeps getting followed by the same kid who wants his cake. The kid is jumping on a giant waterbed in the room where the gems are supposed to go, and Mr. Krabs accidentally pops it, causing a huge explosion and the whole building to get filled with water. And then there's that awesome ending. The waves destroy the entire building right in the middle of the food fight, and it's insane. Mr. Krabs slips and accidentally lights off fireworks that he stole from the kid earlier. The whole building explodes, the kid gets his cake, and he's surfing on the waves, and then the balloon kid comes flying by, and they all go off into the This episode's amazing! This episode's able to tell an amazing story and have great comedy to accompany it. It's awesome, and I really, really love this episode. And there's a reason why I keep coming back to this one. I'm even gonna go as far as saying that this might be the best episode of the post-sequel era. Yeah, I'm not even joking. I really can't think of a way to end this review other than just saying, go watch this episode, because it really is this great. Episode 209A, SpongeBob's Place. SpongeBob makes a more successful restaurant than the Krusty Krab at his house. Kinda. It's very hard to describe the plot for this episode because there's so much stuff going on in it. And unfortunately, it's not the good kind like Krusty Catering. But before I go over that, I'll go over a few details that I found interesting. This episode seems to have better night sky and sunset backgrounds than most other episodes this season. Also, after the scene with Mr. Krabs pouring a bunch of lava, there's a lava transition instead of a bubble transition. Also, this episode has a lot of gags revolving Mr. Krabs' eyes. They move when SpongeBob flings a patty between them. There's a shot of Mr. Krabs pushing SpongeBob off of one of the eyes in kind of like a shadow-type sequence. There's a shot of Mr. Krabs, like, banging on the doors of Krusty Krab with his eyes. There's a shot where his eyes literally just completely break like glass. There's a new squid kind of background character model that they use in this episode that is really pleasant to look at. SpongeBob literally has a can of Krabby Patties, and while we're on the subject of it, there's actually a pretty good sequence of him making the Krabby Patties. Anyway, I've said quite a bit of good stuff about this episode, and I don't want to distract from how I really feel about it. This episode is just a rehash through and through. It's a rehash of Pickles, it's a rehash of Patty hype, it's a rehash of Welcome to the Chum Bucket, SpongeBob You're Fired, Lay Big Switch, SpongeBob Long Pants, Bummer Vacation, Hooky. Heck, the episode even references the fried boot joke from that episode. They knew what they were doing, and they knew it was a rehash. And I mean, sure, in most of those episodes I just mentioned, in episodes like Squilliam Returns, Mr. Krabs and Squidward can't cook, but that doesn't mean that this is supposed to be a regular occurrence on the show. And what's not helping is that a majority of the episodes I just named are more entertaining than this one. Of course, not all of them, but a lot of them are. Another rehash-like thing is that this episode pretty much just feels like an 11-minute version of the Krusty Krab scenes in Suds. And then Mr. Krabs is probably at his worst in this episode. He even directly contradicts what he said in Krusty Krab training video when he says, "The customer is always wrong." And no, I'm not making this up, that's an actual quote from this episode. Mr. Krabs no longer thinks it's the customer is always right, he thinks it's the customer is always wrong. He's super flanderized in this episode, and it's not entertaining in the slightest. And what's not helping is that the customers are super ignorant in this episode. They literally see Mr. Krabs dress up as SpongeBob, and then they think it's actually SpongeBob just because he says it is. And even though they don't like the patties, they eat them anyway because SpongeBob made them, but as soon as they find out SpongeBob didn't make them, they can't eat it anymore. Like, come on, the people in Bikini Bottom were never the smartest, but they were never this stupid. And then, of course, SpongeBob's new restaurant or whatever is more successful than the always. Mr. Krabs takes a huge advantage of SpongeBob. And then there's a bunch of filler with Squidward. He goes to work and no one's there, and instead of going home or sleeping or something, he just sings a song about how he hates everyone. And then after SpongeBob's place gets shut down, which was a very slow scene, by the way, they go back to the Krusty Krab just in time to see Squidward singing the song, and then they laugh at him. And then they try to pull some heartwarming ending, but it doesn't end up working out anyway, because it's really not heartwarming in the slightest. And what doesn't help is that it takes about 3 minutes for the health department to shut down SpongeBob's place, and then Mr. Krabs has to explain it to SpongeBob, and then we get some unfunny humor, and then they have to go back to the Krusty Krab. Then there's the scene with Squidward, and then there's the ending. So the episode just feels like it drags on. And the setup for the episode is pretty slow, too. And there's a scene of everyone eating, and then there's Mr. Krabs trying to justify keeping the name Krusty Krab, and then he tries to prove a point to Squidward, and then he sends SpongeBob home, and then SpongeBob sets up the restaurant. It's so long and complicated. Also, was this episode funny? No! I can only recall laughing at this episode one time. Another thing you'll notice is that the plot is all over the place. I had a pretty hard time trying to come up with a plot for this episode because there's so many different things going on. And while, yes, that did work in Krusty Catering, at least in that episode I could figure out the plot, and that actually was a really good episode. And then when this episode's not just throwing something random at the wall, it's rehashing other episodes. Well, I'm sorry, but... Well, actually, no, I'm really not sorry. This is a bad episode, which is definitely an understatement. Also, there's this weird line at the start where some guy says that he could die and, like, go to heaven or something like that. It was really weird. Also, there's a shot in SpongeBob's house with a lot of references in it, which is definitely a good point to bring up when reviewing episode 209B, Plankton Gets the Boot. Both of these episodes have tons of references in SpongeBob's house, and it's actually really cool. Well, anyway, on with Plankton Gets the Boot. This episode's about SpongeBob trying to help Plankton win Karen back after she kicks him out of the chum bucket. Now, of course, this episode is very reminiscent to Single Cell Anniversary in some aspects, but I feel like it's just different enough for it to feel like a new episode rather than a rehash. And the ways SpongeBob tries to help Plankton are very creative. I laughed pretty hard when Plankton got mad at Patrick for not being able to fit through the tiny door. And there's a nice therapy-like sequence where SpongeBob kinda tries to comfort Plankton. That was pretty entertaining. And I like the scene where SpongeBob tried to give Plankton a makeover, at least in terms of, like, the idea and stuff. However, the part where SpongeBob cross-dresses was pretty weird. And then, of course, Plankton tries to win Karen back by having SpongeBob dress up like a robot and have the two go on a date at the Chum Bucket. And then Plankton actually does end up winning Karen back, but of course the episode has one of those endings where the plot kind of restarts itself. Which, yes, I can say kind of ruins this episode in a way, but I didn't mind it that much. Also, there's quite a few funny things in this episode, such as the part where the random guy just goes up and accepts Plankton's apology. And also when Robot SpongeBob says they're gonna print 1,347 babies. Anyway, I'd say this is a pretty good episode. Also, two things. There's a shot of Plankton literally getting the boot, and Plankton is now 50% evil rather than 1%. Well guys, we've finally made it this far. We're almost done with part 1, with just one episode left to go. Well, while this has been fun, I'm getting a little bit tired of reviewing every single episode. So, please welcome, Kaylin Blair.
This episode is very creative. The thought of SpongeBob and Patrick believing something and then Squidward having to get it through their heads that it's not like that. It's really funny, and it goes a different direction in, say, an episode like Sold. Because Sold is an episode that SpongeBob and Patrick believe one thing, and then Squidward has to tell them the other thing, but he turns it into his own spin and takes it a bit too far. In that episode, he takes it a bit too far by... SpongeBob and Patrick want to actually come and see the people that live inside their house and see their old house, so he ends up having to, fool SpongeBob and Patrick because he doesn't want them to live as neighbors. But in this episode, they take it as Squidward, yes, he tries to get it through their thick head, but SpongeBob and Patrick actually convince Squidward and actually makes him believe that the life insurance is actually real and it actually works. And it takes some really funny shenanigans of Squidward messing with a tough guy and him just... the tough guy punching himself in the face is really funny, and it's entertaining to see Squidward do something like that. And the whole scene with Squidward going through I forgot what the machine is called. I think it's called like the incinerator. I don't know what it was actually called.
The machine is called the Sushi Maker.
Seeing him go through that, seeing him get his comeuppance, which I guess he didn't really deserve comeuppance because he kind of did. He didn't really do anything. He kind of got convinced by SpongeBob and Patrick. So it was funny, but I mean, I don't think he all the way deserved it. And then the ending with SpongeBob and Patrick actually realizes it because Mr. Krabs is the one that gave it through their thick heads. And that's how the episode ends. Well, it doesn't end that way. It ends with SpongeBob and Patrick stomping on a sea spider because Squidward thinks that the sea spider was the actual good luck, which is how he actually survived. The Sushi Maker, yeah, that's what it was called. And yeah, I think that this is a good episode.
Thank you, Kaylin. Anyway, if you're wondering what I thought of this episode, I actually thought it was pretty good. I went in expecting it to just be another kind of mediocre episode, but no, I was actually pleasantly surprised and it was really good. I liked the part with Mr. Krabs, and the opening scene was pretty good, but there's really not much to say about this episode. Well, anyway, that's gonna do it for part 1. I'll see you guys in part 2, coming whenever I finish it. Alright, bye guys.